Hey there, sailors and history buffs. Welcome to Boom on the Water, where we dive into the most fascinating naval disasters and triumphs throughout history. I'm your captain on this voyage through time, and I'm thrilled you've decided to come aboard. In our last episode, we watched as the mighty HMS Hood, pride of the Royal Navy and floating palace of the seas, met its tragic end in just 9 minutes at the hands of the German battleship Bismarck. We saw how reputation means nothing when your deck armor is thinner than a politician's promises, and how one unlucky hit can send 1,415 souls to a watery grave faster than you can say, design flaw. The British got their revenge on Bismarck just days later, but that cold comfort didn't bring back the Hood or her crew. If you enjoyed that tale of naval hubris and tragedy, do consider dropping anchor by hitting that subscribe button. Your support helps this channel stay afloat as we continue to explore history's most fascinating maritime moments. Now, let's set sail for today's story. The date is April 6, 1945. The place is the naval base at Okinawa, Japan. World War II is lurching toward its inevitable conclusion, and Imperial Japan is like a boxer in the 15th round, battered, bloody, and barely standing. But they're not done throwing punches yet. At dawn, a massive shape slips its moorings and begins moving slowly out to sea. It's the Yamato, the most powerful battleship ever built, the pride of the Japanese Navy, and a vessel so enormous it seems to belong to a different era of naval warfare altogether. At 862 feet long and displacing over 72,000 tons fully loaded, Yamato wasn't just a warship. It was a floating steel mountain, a testament to Japanese industrial might, and the embodiment of national pride. With 9 18.1-inch guns, the largest ever mounted on a warship, Yamato could hurl shells weighing as much as a small car over 25 miles. But on this April morning, Yamato isn't sailing toward glory. It's sailing toward oblivion, on what amounts to a nautical suicide mission. And in exactly 50 hours, it will be lying in 3 pieces on the ocean floor, along with most of its crew. What follows is the story of Operation Tango, the Japanese Navy's last desperate gamble, a mission so obviously doomed that the officers planning it literally drank a farewell sake toast the night before setting sail. It's a tale of fanatical determination, staggering waste, and the brutal reality that in modern warfare, the biggest gun doesn't mean much when your enemy controls the skies. Welcome to Operation Tango, Japan's suicide fleet of sadness. To understand why anyone would send their finest remaining warship on what was essentially a ceremonial suicide run, we need to roll back the clock and understand the dire situation Japan found itself in by the spring of 1945. The Pacific War had started with spectacular Japanese success. The surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, the fall of Singapore, the conquest of the Philippines. For a brief moment in history, Imperial Japan controlled an empire stretching from the Indian Ocean to the mid-Pacific, from the Aleutian Islands to the edge of Australia. But that high-water mark of Japanese expansion didn't last long. The tide began to turn at Midway in June 1942, where Japan lost 4 fleet carriers in a single day. From there, it was a long, grinding retreat as American industrial might and growing military proficiency slowly reclaimed island after bloody island. By early 1945, the situation for Japan had become truly desperate. The American advance had reached Iwo Jima and Okinawa, the very doorstep of the Japanese home islands. American submarines had decimated Japan's merchant fleet, cutting off oil, rubber, and other vital resources. American bombers were reducing Japanese cities to ash on a daily basis. And the Imperial Japanese Navy, once the pride of the nation, it was a shadow of its former self. Most of its carriers were on the bottom of the ocean. Fuel shortages kept many remaining warships idle in port. Naval aviation had been decimated, with most experienced pilots long since killed and replacements receiving minimal training before being thrown into combat. It was against this backdrop of impending defeat that the Yamato prepared for its final voyage. Yamato and its sister ship Musashi had been conceived in the late 1930s as the ultimate expression of battleship design. At a time when naval treaties limited other nations to battleships displacing 35,000 tons with 16-inch guns, Japan decided to go all in on super battleships. Yamato and Musashi would be twice that size, with guns that could outrange and outpunch any opposing battleship. The problem? By the time these Leviathans were completed in 1941 and 1942, aircraft carriers had already proven themselves to be the new kings of naval warfare. The battleship, that majestic dreadnought that had dominated the seas for decades, was rapidly becoming obsolete. The Japanese didn't fully internalize this lesson, even as evidence mounted. Musashi was sunk by American carrier aircraft at the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, hit by at least 17 bombs and 19 torpedoes before finally succumbing. Yamato, meanwhile, had participated in several naval engagements but had never actually fired its main guns at an enemy ship. This $200 million weapon system had spent most of the war avoiding combat or serving as an oversized anti-aircraft platform. By April 1945, Yamato was one of only a handful of major Japanese warships still operational. And with American forces landing on Okinawa on April 1st, Japanese military leaders were desperate for a way to strike back, to somehow stem the American advance before it reached the home islands. The plan they concocted was Operation Tango, and it was, to put it mildly, not their finest hour of strategic thinking. The concept was simple in its fatalism. Yamato, along with a light cruiser and 8 destroyers, would sail to Okinawa, beach itself near the American landing zones, and use its massive guns to blast away at the invasion fleet until it was destroyed either by return fire or by its own crew after its ammunition was exhausted. Let's pause for a moment to consider the many problems with this plan. First, Yamato was given just enough fuel for a one-way trip. This wasn't an oversight. It was by design. There was no expectation that the ship would return. In fact, the plan specifically called for it to be deliberately run aground and used as a stationary gun platform until destroyed. Second, there would be no air cover. None. Zero. Despite knowing full well that American carrier aircraft had sunk Musashi just 6 months earlier, and despite the fact that the Americans now had roughly 1,500 aircraft operating from carriers in land bases around Okinawa, Yamato would sail without a single plane to protect it. Third, even if by some miracle Yamato reached Okinawa, its impact would be minimal. The American invasion was already well established. A few hours of shellfire from Yamato's guns, however impressive, wouldn't change the strategic situation. In essence, Operation Tango wasn't a military operation at all. It was a symbolic gesture, a nautical seppuku, aimed at demonstrating that Japan's warriors would choose death before dishonor. The Japanese sailors and officers weren't idiots. They knew exactly what they were being asked to do. When Vice Admiral Seiichi Ito, commander of the Tango Force, was given his orders, he immediately protested, arguing that the mission was futile and would result in the needless loss of Yamato and its crew. His protests were overruled. Admiral Somu Toyoda, the Naval General Staff Chief, reportedly told him, there would be no sense in saving the fleet at the expense of the loss of Okinawa. That would only mean the fleet would be destroyed at its moorings. The night before Yamato departed, senior officers gathered for a farewell sake party. They weren't celebrating impending victory, they were holding a wake for themselves and their ships. The sake cups used in the ritual were deliberately broken afterward, symbolizing that they would never return. At 3:20 p.m. on April 6, 1945, Yamato and its small escort fleet departed Tokuyama. The battleship was loaded with 170 tons of ammunition for its main guns, yet carried only enough fuel for a one-way journey. This forced economy extended to the crew's rations, which consisted of combat biscuits and dried rice. There would be no return voyage, no need for a balanced diet. As Yamato departed, sailors from other ships lined the docks, many in tears, watching as Japan's last battleship sailed off to die. Civilians who saw the great ship pass reportedly whispered, "There goes the last hope." But the Americans had been expecting something like this. U.S. naval intelligence had broken Japanese naval codes long ago, and they knew Yamato was coming. More importantly, they knew exactly what to do about it. American submarines spotted Yamato almost immediately after it left port and began shadowing the Japanese force, reporting its position, course, and speed. By the morning of April 7th, Admiral Raymond Spruance, commander of the U.S. Fifth Fleet, had ordered Task Force 58 under Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher to intercept and destroy Yamato before it could reach Okinawa. The Americans threw a staggering amount of air power at the problem. 386 aircraft, including fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers, launched from 8 aircraft carriers. This wasn't just overkill, it was apocalyptic overkill. The Japanese force had already been detected by 8 a.m., and the first American strike was in the air by 10 a.m. Aboard Yamato, the crew prepared for their final battle. Anti-aircraft guns were manned, damage control parties stood ready, and the massive main turrets were loaded with special beehive shells designed to function as giant shotguns against aircraft. These shells, each containing thousands of steel balls, created a fearsome spread of anti-aircraft fire, but they were a last-ditch innovation of a Navy that had run out of better options. At 12:32 p.m., lookouts aboard Yamato spotted the first wave of American aircraft approaching. The great ship unleashed everything it had, its anti-aircraft batteries creating a storm of flak while its main guns fired those special beehive shells. The sea around Yamato erupted with splashes as shells exploded, filling the air with deadly fragments. It was an impressive display, but against 386 aircraft attacking in coordinated waves, it was ultimately futile. The American pilots had been well briefed, and they executed their attack with ruthless efficiency. The torpedo bombers came in low, skimming the waves to make themselves difficult targets, while dive bombers plunged from above. The first torpedo hit Yamato at 12:41 p.m., striking the port side, then another and another. Bombs began to find their mark as well, punching through the deck armor and causing fires throughout the ship. One bomb hit near the bridge, killing several senior officers instantly. Another struck near the aft main gun turret, jamming it in position. The Japanese destroyers put up a valiant defense, creating smoke screens and adding their own anti-aircraft fire to the cacophony, but they were overwhelmed. Several were hit and severely damaged. The destroyer Isocase had its bow blown off by a torpedo. By 1 p.m., less than 30 minutes into the attack, Yamato had been hit by 2 bombs and at least 8 torpedoes, most on the port side. The great ship was listing heavily, taking on water, and struggling to maintain headway. Counter-flooding of starboard compartments temporarily reduced the list, but the damage was too severe to overcome. A second wave of American aircraft arrived at 1:40 p.m., finding a Yamato already grievously wounded but still fighting. This time, the torpedo bombers concentrated on the starboard side, effectively neutralizing the counter-flooding measures. Bombs continued to rain down, starting more fires and killing hundreds of crew members. By 2:02 p.m., Yamato's fate was sealed. The list had increased to 15 to 18 degrees, and the ship had slowed to a crawl. Captain Kosuke Aruga ordered all remaining crew to assemble on the deck and prepare to abandon ship. But at 2:05 p.m., something catastrophic happened. Exactly what triggered it remains debated, but the most likely explanation is that fires reached one of the main gun magazines. The resulting explosion was so massive it was visible from 100 miles away, creating a mushroom cloud that rose 20,000 feet into the air. Yamato, the pride of Japan, literally tore itself apart. The ship broke into 3 sections and sank rapidly, taking 2,498 of its 3,332 crew members to the bottom with it. The entire battle, from first sighting to final explosion, had lasted just 101 minutes. Of the Japanese escort ships, 4 destroyers were sunk, and the remaining 5 were so heavily damaged they played no further role in the war. American losses, just 10 aircraft and 12 airmen. It was one of the most lopsided naval engagements in history. When news of Yamato's destruction reached Tokyo, Emperor Hirohito reportedly wept. Admiral Toyoda, who had authorized the mission over Vice Admiral Ito's objections, merely commented, "I am sorry for the men who died." The sinking of Yamato marked the effective end of the Imperial Japanese Navy as a fighting force. A few destroyers and submarines continued to operate until the war's end 4 months later, but the fleet that had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor just 3.5 years earlier had essentially ceased to exist. So what lessons can we draw from this tragedy? Perhaps the most obvious is the danger of allowing national pride and cultural notions of honor to override military reality. Operation Tango wasn't a military operation in any meaningful sense. It was a ritualistic sacrifice, a gesture that cost thousands of lives without altering the course of the war in the slightest. Another lesson lies in the rapidly changing nature of naval warfare. Yamato represented the pinnacle of battleship design, yet it was sunk without ever coming within range of its intended targets. In the age of aircraft carriers and long-range bombers, the battleship's day had passed, regardless of how big its guns were or how thick its armor. But perhaps the most profound lesson is the human one. The men aboard Yamato knew they were sailing to their deaths, yet they went anyway, bound by duty and the rigid hierarchy of Japanese military culture. Their courage cannot be questioned, but the wisdom of those who sent them on this doomed mission certainly can be. As we remember Yamato today, we should think not just of a powerful warship, but of the men who called her home. Many were barely out of their teens, young sailors who would never see Japan again. They deserve to be remembered not as fanatical warriors, but as human beings caught in the machinery of a war that had already been lost. The wreck of Yamato now lies 1,340 feet beneath the East China Sea, a silent monument to misplaced pride and futile sacrifice. In 2016, a remotely operated vehicle captured the first detailed images of the wreck, showing the massive hull broken into pieces just as witnesses described in 1945. Today, Yamato lives on in Japanese popular culture, featured in countless books, films, and anime series. Perhaps most famously, it appears in fictionalized form in Space Battleship Yamato, a science fiction epic where the sunken ship is rebuilt as a spacecraft to save humanity. It seems fitting that in fiction at least, Yamato found the glorious destiny that eluded it in reality. So the next time you find yourself in a completely hopeless situation, just remember, at least you're not commanding a battleship with a one-way fuel supply against 386 enemy aircraft. Talk about a bad day at the office. This has been Operation Tango, Japan's suicide fleet of sadness. Thanks for sailing with me through this tragic tale of naval desperation. On our next voyage through the high seas of history, we'll be exploring an even more absurd naval disaster. Join me for The Russian Navy versus Itself, The Voyage of the Damned. In 1904, the Russian Baltic Fleet sailed halfway around the world to fight the Japanese, but their greatest enemy turned out to be their own incompetence. They mistook fishing boats for torpedo boats, fired on their own ships, and then got utterly demolished at the Battle of Tsushima. It's a masterclass in nautical self-destruction that makes Operation Tango look like a stroke of genius by comparison. Until then, remember to subscribe if you enjoyed this tale, drop a like to help others find these stories, and always pack enough fuel for a round trip when challenging the entire U.S. Navy. See you on the high seas of history.